Welcome to the Sanctions Age, the podcast that explores how sanctions are changing the world. My name is Isfandir Batmagelic. Today's show is about the humanitarian consequences of sanctions. In just about every country that has been targeted by a major sanctions program, including Cuba, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Venezuela, to name a few, we can observe significant humanitarian consequences. Sanctions contribute to shortages of essential goods, hinder access to healthcare, and exacerbate poverty and social instability. Understanding the humanitarian impact of sanctions is crucial for assessing their true cost and evaluating whether they are truly effective. My guest today has conducted extensive research to demonstrate how sanctions can hamper access to basic human needs, like food and medicine. She has also helped foster dialogue and devise solutions to mitigate those humanitarian consequences. Erica Moret is Policy Director at PoliSync, Center for International Policy Engagement, and the coordinator of the Sanctions and Sustainable Peace Hub at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Erica, thanks for coming onto the show.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start by explaining what we mean when we talk about the humanitarian harms of sanctions. Sanctions refers to a wide range of policies, and so obviously those policies can have a wide range of consequences. We know that sanctions can impede humanitarian trade, specifically trade in food and medicine, but they can also impede humanitarian aid operations in ways that make it more difficult to respond to natural disasters or, let's say, a crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you describe the main reasons why sanctions lead to humanitarian harms and what those harms typically look like?
In theory, sanctions are designed today in a way that mitigates humanitarian impacts. In theory, they shouldn't have negative impacts on ordinary civilians, and they also shouldn't impact negatively on humanitarian assistance in areas where that is needed. But in reality, we're starting to see a return to concerns over humanitarian impacts over the last few years, and there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, we need to look back a little bit in the history of sanctions, and I know you've been talking about this already with some of your other podcast invitees. So the first reason is that we saw the development of targeted sanctions around 20 years ago, as your listeners will well know. And this came about because of the outcry associated with humanitarian impacts linked to some of the big sanctions regimes of the day, UN sanctions against Iraq, against the former Yugoslavia, against Haiti, and also United States sanctions against Cuba, which, as you may know, are the longest standing sanctions in history. And at one point in time, they even extended to food and medicine. So what we saw in the late 1990s, the early 2000s, was this outcry, as I mentioned already, and a realization that these comprehensive sanctions or full-blown embargoes against countries, which even limited food, medicine, general trade, and so on, weren't acceptable on an ethical or moral or even legal standpoint. So we saw a number of initiatives come together that were aiming to minimize impacts on ordinary civilians. And this was when we saw the creation of targeted sanctions. And these typically tended to be asset freezes, travel bans, and arms embargoes in the early days. So in the 2000s and entering into the 2010s, most UN and most autonomous sanctions regimes were characterized by these kinds of highly targeted measures against individuals, against companies, and so on, really designed in a way to minimize impacts on the wider population. What we've then seen, however, over the past, I would say around 10 years, is this creeping return back to comprehensive style sanctions in certain instances. It's certainly not the case that all sanctions regimes around the world are like this. There's probably, something between 6, 7 to 10 that we can count on our hands that are starting to resemble de facto comprehensive sanctions regimes. And this, I really need to emphasize, is not the objectives of those who are designing the sanctions. There are no sanctions regimes that are deliberately curtailing access to essential goods, to medicines, medical devices, food, and so on. But because of the complexity of the sanctions regime today, we're starting to see a whole host of different unintended consequences playing out.
Erica, a big part of your research has been on helping policymakers understand how sanctions may be contributing to negative humanitarian outcomes. And one country that you've worked on, which I think is a good illustration of how even targeted measures can have fairly broad negative humanitarian outcomes, is Syria. I'm interested to know from you, what are the humanitarian consequences of sanctions that you've seen in Syria? And given that Syria is a really complex environment where, of course, the Assad government has also taken a lot of decisions that have had negative consequences for its own people, not least decisions to extend the conflict of the civil war, how can we differentiate between the negative humanitarian realities that are attributable to sanctions from those that may have other causes, including mismanagement by a targeted government or simply the chaos that's unfolding in a country because of a conflict that the sanctions have been imposed in response to?
Sure. It's a really good question because, again, on paper, what we have is a series of targeted sanctions, as you correctly said. But when you look at them cumulatively, you start to see that we have sanctions now imposed on different targets within Syria by the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, there's the League of Arab Nations, there's a whole host of other countries as well. And when you start to consider them in unison, it's this very complicated web of overlapping legislation and restrictions that really complicate matters for private sector actors engaging in legal trade, for banks, for financial institutions, also for NGOs, for society groups, and so on. And there's other reasons for this complexity as well. The second is that we don't just have sanctions, we also have a whole load of other regulations, which you often see being imposed alongside sanctions in certain contexts, as you know. So we have export controls, which limit access to dual-use goods that can either have a civilian or military application. And for humanitarian actors, this might be laptops or generators or equipment used for teaching and education or for heating schools and so on. They can have a dual application. There are also anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism regulations. There are also counter-terrorism regulations that apply in the northwest of the country, imposed by the United Nations and other governments and so on. And we even have the listings of the Financial Action Task Force, which kind of add to the complex regulatory environment and restrictions and considerations that everybody needs to be thinking about when they're operating in Syria. So cumulatively, we have this situation where it's so complicated to operate in a country like Syria now that we see these problems called overcompliance or de-risking or the chilling effect, which refer to the problem that's growing around the world of all types of organizations, whether it's public sector, private sector, not-for-profit, having to either curtail or slow down their operations or even cease them in certain countries because of this regulatory complexity. And this happens even when the trade in medicines and goods and so on is permitted. And often it's just because it's too complicated, it's too expensive. The risk of fines is so enormous, it could enter into the billions of US dollars if you're fined by the US Treasury. And so the incentives are not always there to remain in a country like Syria. Incidentally, there are also US extraterritorial or secondary sanctions that apply in Syria, which add to this kind of risk and complication for third parties. So really, I would say Syria is one of the most complex set of sanctions regimes we see, even though it isn't necessarily the broadest. Some of them apply to the Central Bank of Syria, to the oil and gas sector, to internet providers, to airlines, and so on. So we really do have a very, still targeted, but really approaching, again, a kind of comprehensive sanctions regime, if you consider it in its entirety.
And Erica, I can see the line that can be drawn from, let's say, a very complex regulatory environment with, a lot of risk for different kinds of actors, humanitarian actors, private sector actors, and a situation where they may decide to, as you say, curtail their operations or even cease their operations. And you can draw a line from that to negative outcomes for ordinary people. So if a large organization that was providing food aid decides that they can no longer do so, then, it's pretty easy to understand why there would be that negative outcome. But I'm also interested to understand how you define the humanitarian harms that are really attributable to sanctions, especially in a country like Syria. So when you are approaching these research projects that you've done, how do you disentangle the harms that are clearly related to sanctions effects from the reality that Syria is a country that's been through a brutal civil war with a government that has made plenty of its own mistakes in terms of how to try and help its own people avoid some of these negative outcomes? How do you disentangle those two things?
It's a really important question, and I'm glad you asked that because you and I have worked on this topic together in the Swiss Network for International Studies funded 3-year project where we looked into supply chains of essential goods to heavily sanctioned countries. So I'm glad you asked that question. What I want to stress first of all is this is an incredibly politicized domain and highly contested. It's also an area where disinformation is an enormous consideration. And so it means that when we're talking about some of these topics, we absolutely have to get it right when we're talking about causality. But just taking a step back and talking about the food side of the house, because I think it's a really good example, we have to come back to the point that I made earlier, which is no sanctions regimes present today are deliberately curtailing access to food or medicine, medical devices, and so on. They're typically including humanitarian exemptions or carve-outs that allow for humanitarian assistance and related services and so on. That's what we need to remember. And there are some incredibly dedicated people behind the scenes who are designing the sanctions, whether it's in governments, in the European Union, in the United Nations, who are working tirelessly to try and remedy some of the barriers that we might see. So coming back to your question as to how do you differentiate, I would say that first of all, we have questions of impeded humanitarian access and assistance. And this can play out in a number of ways. A really big issue is relating to financial sector de-risking that I mentioned already. Humanitarian actors, NGOs in particular, are struggling to access financial services when they're operating in sanctioned jurisdictions that are suffering from de-risking. And this may translate into things like having delayed payments, refused payments. They may even have their banks closed down and so on. And to give a really stark example of this, I was running what was called the Compliance Dialogue on Humanitarian Payments to Syria. It was funded by the Swiss government and the European Union. We were working with the World Bank and the UK government, US Treasury and plenty of others. And the example that really stuck in my mind from those days were all of the humanitarian actors saying, we cannot use bank accounts, all our transactions are being cancelled, we have to carry cash in suitcases. And that poses enormous risks to humanitarian actors to have to be going around with all this cash on them without any insurance, without any security and so on. It's a massive issue. And so that's one area that I would say is a big concern. Payments. At a major humanitarian conference, one big humanitarian actor said that payment issues are now the number one threat to the humanitarian space. And a lot of this is linked to the complexity, confusion, and risk associated with sanctions and other regulations. The next area I would say, and it's one that's a lot more contested and more heated, I guess, in the debates, is the way in which ordinary people can be impacted by sanctions. And what I say when I'm interacting with government officials, UN and so on, and others who are imposing these very broad reaching sanctions regimes is there are a number of knock-on effects, unintended consequences, you can refer them that way, or impacts that you mentioned already. Things like barriers to trade that shouldn't be happening, but they are because of this complex, confusing environment. It's expensive as well to get legal advice and so on. So we're seeing pretty much every part of a supply chain of medicines, medical devices, food and so on to a country like Syria or Iran or North Korea, DPRK, or Venezuela and so on, suffering from this overcompliance and de-risking problem. And in the research that we did together, another example I like to give is every single person we spoke to had fantastic examples of where their companies were overcomplying or de-risking from countries that I just mentioned. And this translated not just to the banks, but also to the medical companies themselves, the shippers, the insurers, the airline companies, the technology companies, whether it's software or hardware. So it really is a big problem that is probably much bigger than we actually realize. And I would say then there are other areas. So we've talked about trade, we've talked about finance, we've talked about direct impacts on humanitarian assistance. Other types of NGOs also suffer from these payment issues. We did an event in Geneva recently where we brought together different NGOs and civil society actors that were being impacted by de-risking, and we were trying to come up with ideas for innovative digital payment solutions. We had people there from protecting cultural heritage to gender, to women's rights, to environmental NGOs, climate change. You name it, they were there around the table. It's not just the humanitarian actors, development and so on. So there is an issue here that we're not necessarily hearing about, but it is leading to fragmentation of the global economy, fragmentation of global trade and global finance. And hopefully we can talk about that because we know that's not in our interest. It's not the objective of the sanctions. And if I may, one more area that is often overlooked is in the area of remittances. I think you've also done a bit of work on this, and it's again an understudied area. What are remittances? My father's Argentinian. He always sent a huge amount of his salary and his earnings to family back in Argentina to support them when times were hard. Anyone whose family is from a poorer country will have seen the same thing in their families. Remittances represent a really vital economic lifeline at times of economic stress, and they work in a counter-cyclical manner. When the economy is doing well, the remittances go down, and vice versa. And having said that, remittances are subject to the same de-risking pressures that we're seeing humanitarian actors encounter and all the organizations and companies that I mentioned. So when families are trying to send money home, there are all these barriers in place. And that's quite worrying because remittances can be essential for helping families pay for essential goods, set up new businesses, education, and so on. And we saw in the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, remittances were absolutely vital to a large number of countries. And so in line with the Sustainable Development Goals that call for the bringing down in remittance sending costs, there is a lot that needs to be done here as well in countries where there are complex sanctions regimes deemed to be high-risk environments.
Erica, it's very clear that, there are these comprehensive impacts that you're describing, that it goes beyond even what we traditionally think is humanitarian activity. It can extend to things like the ability to provide educational services, to provide health services, and obviously in this case of remittances. And you also describe a global context where it's about more than just the effects of sanctions on humanitarian trade. It's really about this payments problem that's existing across financial institutions in different jurisdictions. And I want to turn to another example of maybe this idea that you laid out for us, that we're creeping towards comprehensive sanctions again because of the broad nature of these problems. And you recently did some work for the Norwegian Refugee Council looking at sanctions effects on the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. And the context here is that in the summer of 2021, the Biden administration moved to freeze the central bank assets in Afghanistan after the Taliban took over the country. And this had a kind of sudden impact on the ability of Afghan banks to connect to the global financial system. And although the measure was pretty targeted, there was this kind of effect that was comprehensive, and it had a significant impact on humanitarian activity. In your view, what does this experience in Afghanistan tell us about this problem that you're describing about creeping back towards comprehensive sanctions, even if that's not the intention?
Yeah, I would actually say that Afghanistan is a really different case to some of the other examples that we've already spoken about, like Syria. I would also say like Iran, DPRK. And the reason for that is this, that there have been some very long-standing sanctions in place against different targets within Afghanistan, namely, of course, the Taliban and Haqqani network. You have UN sanctions and you also have United States sanctions, and they differ very much in their scope. And what we saw, therefore, when the Taliban resumed de facto control in Afghanistan, as you mentioned, we saw a set of sanctions that were no longer adapted to the reality of the country. And we haven't really seen a situation like that before, where we have designated terrorists or kind of counterinsurgency type sanctions now applying to pretty much the entirety of a de facto government. Pretty much every cabinet minister and, all the different leadership figures are designated terrorist actors under the US legislation, and also subject to a variety of UN sanctions. So this is the situation that was very particular in Afghanistan, that we haven't really seen that much like that in the past. And then the problem we started to see, therefore, was that when you're delivering humanitarian assistance, Afghanistan suffers, of course, from multiple overlapping financial, economic, security, fiscal challenges or crises. We saw the intensification of humanitarian needs in the country just at the time when humanitarian actors suddenly encountered new barriers. And it wasn't per se because of the sanctions, it was more because of the issues of recognition of the different Afghan authorities. So when you're making payments into the country, you typically will need some form of engagement with the Afghan central bank, which is referred to as DAB. And you can't do that under the current restrictions. And so therefore, that already impacts on payments to and from the country. And in research I went on to do with the UN and with others later on, we found that major companies within Afghanistan simply couldn't make any outgoing payments using banks. If you were a technology company in Afghanistan and you want to source laptops for a new World Health Organization project, for example, you cannot pay Microsoft or whoever it may be using banking transfers. So you're phased out of all of this important trade and important humanitarian responses. And so that's one of the issues. The second issue, I think, was under the US regulations, there wasn't a very clear definition of what the Taliban actually constituted. And so there was a lot of fear, therefore, whether you could make payments under the ownership and control restrictions of these different sanctions regimes, make payments that you needed to make as humanitarian actors, in the form of fees and taxes and so on, to the health ministry or the education ministry or any of the other ministries that are vital for carrying out your work. And this is a problem that we're seeing in a growing number of countries because, there's a growing population around the world that are now under the control of either de facto authorities or non-state armed groups. So this is actually a problem that's it's becoming an issue elsewhere as well. And then we come back to the same issue elsewhere as to really the importance of international humanitarian law, whereby humanitarian actors are obliged to provide humanitarian assistance, which is in line with the humanitarian principles of neutrality and impartiality and so on. And if you are hindered from providing assistance or healthcare and so on to certain individuals because they are part of a terrorist group or a sanctioned individual and so on, that puts you at odds with your ability to carry out your work in a principled manner as a humanitarian actor. So I think those are some of the big issues we were seeing in Afghanistan. And I would also say it was a very positive experience in terms of the responsiveness of the US government and of the UN and many, many other groups around the world who were working together tirelessly in those days to clarify and provide better guidance, provide what you'll know, but maybe not all the listeners would know. Sanctions regimes are typically accompanied by guidance, and in the US case, frequently asked questions and so on. They're also increasingly accompanied by standing exemptions of different kinds. And what we saw in the Afghanistan case was some really exemplary work across the board between different stakeholders and a very responsive stance taken by the US Treasury and the State Department in listening to the challenges and amending a lot of that guidance in a beneficial way. And I think to the extent that the exemptions in relation to Afghanistan were very much seen as a benchmark for what should be done elsewhere, ultimately.
Erica, the idea that there are these licenses, exemptions, and guidance is really critical to the point you made at the very beginning of our conversation that to the extent that there are negative effects from sanctions on things like access to food in a lot of jurisdictions, it's an unintended consequence. And that, as demonstrated by, let's say, US policymakers stepping in to try and ease some of the difficulties introduced after the sanctions on the Taliban started to have new effects post the Taliban takeover. I mean, that suggests that there is this genuine effort on the part of policymakers to try and mitigate these harms. But can you explain in a little bit more detail, how do these exemptions and licenses actually work? I mean, what is it about the guidance that makes a difference for the regulatory environment that is so complex?
Yeah, well, if you had asked me that question a couple of years ago, you would have got a completely different answer. And so, as you will know, there's been a really landmark development when it comes to humanitarian exemption since December 2022. And what happened was there had been, of course, 10 or more years of advocacy from humanitarian actors, from the International Committee of the Red Cross, from Norwegian Refugee Council, Médecins Sans Frontières, a whole load of other international NGOs, also from those of us in the academic community, from tri-sector groups, which I hope we talk about in a little while, that play a really important role. And collectively, the message was to the governments that the current system is not working. And the current system tended to be ad hoc exceptions. In the EU, they're called derogations. In the United States Treasury, they're called specific licenses. And they were basically permissions that you had to apply for in order to do some work for a specific period of time, and they only allow you as your organization to do them. What this community that I mentioned were pushing for many, many years and from many angles was the introduction of standing, broad exemptions. This may sound a bit like gobbledygook to listeners, but they're basically permissions that stay in place either for a certain period of time or indefinitely, that make it clear to those who wish to operate in a certain context, a humanitarian crisis and so on, what they can do, who's allowed to do it, what are the parameters and so on. And it may even allow things like payments to sanctioned individuals if those payments are in support of basic human needs. So we've seen huge amounts of progress on that front. And what we saw first was the announcements of UN Security Council Resolution 2664 back in December 2022. It was a really big day for many of us in the sanctions world. There was a lot of celebrations going on. And it took a lot of us by surprise, actually, as well. And the United States and Ireland were pen holders of that at the UN Security Council. And what that did is applied a humanitarian carve-out or exemption across all United Nations asset freezes. And this was really welcomed and celebrated by the humanitarian community, but also banks and other actors that are needed for humanitarian assistance, supply chains, and so on. And then very, very quickly afterwards, the United States took everybody completely by surprise by adopting very similar types of measures, actually broader ones in many cases, within their US Treasury sanctions. And again, that set a precedent. It set the ball rolling for others feeling they should do the same as well. And so we've started to see the gradual introduction of exemptions in the EU's autonomous and mixed sanctions regimes. Those of a UN nature already, they already automatically were adhering to 2664. And then the same is being developed now in the UK. There are moves elsewhere to do the same. So a lot is happening. There's still a huge amount of work to be done, I would say. There needs to be fine-tuning. What we're seeing is ongoing efforts by US Treasury and others to clarify particular words that might be a source of ongoing confusion, whether it's basic human needs or what exactly is humanitarian. Does education fall under that? Does equipment for kids' entertainment fall under humanitarian? It's all these kind of questions that require a great deal of clarity in order to reassure those various different stakeholders that they can continue vital operations in these different countries.
And Erica, this kind of really important moment where now, given the complex regulatory environment introduced by sanctions, you have this effort at the UN level, at the US level, to say, look, we're going to create these standing exemptions so that there is some clarity for humanitarian actors and companies involved in humanitarian trade. It seems to me that what's really important around that is not just that these exemptions are there and that the guidance is available, but that there's an effort to really implement the policies and make sure that they are being sort of taken advantage of. I'm curious to know how you think implementation of 2664 and the related measures that came out at different national levels is going. And maybe you can tell us a little bit more about these tri-sector dialogues. Who are the three sides in those dialogues, and how are they kind of making sure that government is following through on these important steps that they took a couple years ago?
That's a really good question. The short answer is there's still more work to be done, and everybody realizes that. There's a recognition that 2664 and the ensuing exemptions elsewhere are an absolutely vital first step. They need to be maintained. In cases such as the exemptions that were adopted after the earthquake in Syria in 2023, we saw time-bound exemptions adopted by the EU and UK. And fortunately, they have now been renewed and look set to stay in place. So we're seeing this kind of recognition of the value of these types of exemptions. At the same time, the fact that exemptions don't necessarily mean an opening of a floodgates of humanitarian assistance that will be diverted to sanctioning actors. I think that's often been the fear, that broader exemptions could lead to just aid going AWOL. And I think this is a really important balance to get right. We want compliance, we don't want circumvention, but we also want people to get the goods and services that they need and support they need. I would say that there's a need for things like harmonization across different sanctions regimes and also within different sanctioning authorities. What we often hear people complaining who are dealing with the system within the US or in the EU is they're having to deal with so many different authorities. In the EU, it falls to member states to actually apply the exemptions. So you have a very complicated ongoing system that where harmonization in language is required. Outreach is really important as well. I would say that the exemptions are not going to solve the problem. De-risking and over-compliance are going to continue because of some of the other drivers. And so close working with private sector and others is vital. So this brings us on to the tri-sector groups. What we have is a number of groupings in different countries that originally were composed of governments, NGOs, and banks. And they were largely working together to think about some of the unintended consequences associated with sanctions and counterterrorism regulations and finding ways collectively to address them. So I would say some of the longest standing ones have been in the Netherlands and in the UK. The US has also had one for a long time. And the people who are involved in these are really the leaders in these fields. They're the people who we're reading their articles. They're the leading voices in this particular topic. And what we've seen is some great progress in terms of others setting up their own tri-sector groups or multi-stakeholder groups on these topics. We now have ones in Germany that's just been established. France has had one for a couple of years. Norway, the same. Switzerland is setting one up. I believe Sweden might be. And so the more that these types of engagements happen, I think the better, because it allows for a confidential and trusting setting, ideally, whereby a bank or an NGO can say, look, we're having this problem in this country because of the wording of this sanctions regime, or this exemption isn't clear enough or isn't broad enough, or we need you to engage in some form of outreach to facilitate these flows of medicines and so on. And so I would say these are really important fora for addressing some of these issues.
We've talked a lot about how sanctions and their possible humanitarian consequences are being seen from the standpoint of really the sanctioning countries, and this idea that policymakers in those countries are trying to take more responsibility for the mitigation of some of those potential harms. But I think we should also talk about how the countries that are being subject to sanctions view some of these measures and view the question of humanitarian harms. And there is a lot of pretty serious political rhetoric from the leadership in sanctioned countries around the humanitarian harms of sanctions, because in many cases, leaders in countries like Venezuela, Syria, or Iran can look at potential harms and use them to paint a picture of the sanctions as really unjust, and as something being imposed from outside to hurt ordinary people. Naturally, and especially when we talk about sort of multilateral formats like the UN, this suggests to me that the discussion of the humanitarian harms of sanctions can be highly politicized. How have you and other researchers or people trying to facilitate dialogues, for example, in the tri-sector format, how do you have to navigate this sort of battle of rhetoric? And I'm especially thinking about, let's say, NGOs that have to, on one hand, ask governments in Europe and the US to take certain measures, but on the other hand, have to sort of maintain a working relationship with the governments in the countries in which they're running operations. How do they navigate that, given the political tensions?
The question of rhetoric relating to sanctions and their harms and so on is a really old one. I mean, I did my PhD, I was at the University of Oxford, I did my PhD on US sanctions on Cuba. I focused on the period of the 1990s, but I was carrying out the research in the early 2000s. And it was everywhere in Havana and elsewhere in the island. Every single thing was blamed on sanctions. Having said that, the sanctions were incredibly broad and hard-hitting. But it also coincided with the collapse of the USSR, a collapse of the preferential Soviet relationship, and everything that entailed, and a very, very rapidly changing world around that small Caribbean island that had formerly been supported very heavily by its Soviet allies. And so in that context, I saw firsthand how sanctions were blamed for everything under the sun, even some sometimes strange things. And we see that very much today, I think, in any country that's under, quite broad sanctions regimes. And this is where the question of causality is really important. When we're trying to look at the impacts of sanctions on anything, really, whether they're effective, any type of impact at all, it's incredibly too hard to know with any certainty whether the sanctions have had that particular impact or whether something else has had that impact. And I know some of the work you've done has been really innovative in trying to unravel some of those different threads. We saw that in the case of Iraq, for example, the comprehensive sanctions against Iraq. We saw Saddam Hussein blaming the sanctions for many things, which were later being attributed to economic mismanagement or corruption and so on. But really, this question of causality over correlation is a really important one. Do we know for certain that the sanctions have caused something, or could it be the conflict that's in place, or could it be a whole host of other factors? And in these heavily sanctioned jurisdictions, access to data is often very hard to come by, reliable data, and often will be subject to disinformation or kind of rhetorics that are demonizing the sanctions. So I've tried to look at the variety of different studies that seek to use different types of methodologies to assess the sanctions. And there's a whole host of different approaches. We've got various colleagues that have done some really interesting studies on this front. But again, like the causation over correlation is an endless, timeless question, I think. But having said that, I would also say that it's really important that these global south perspectives are taken into account. Because what we've seen is in Geneva, for example, where I'm based, we see the Human Rights Council discussing unilateral coercive measures, which is a term that was first put forward by the Russian Federation and by the Chinese government with the support earlier on with the Indian Foreign Ministry. Also, Cuba had been using the term UCM, but it's very much a term that has been embraced particularly by Russia, China, Iran, and so on, Cuba, Venezuela. And it really pitches different parts of the world against one another, because you see at the Human Rights Council and UN General Assembly, you're seeing support for this UCM idea and narrative, which calls into question the very legitimacy of autonomous sanctions or unilateral sanctions. And then you have the likes of the United States and EU who are adopting the measures in a way that they believe to be perfectly in line with both domestic and international legal obligations, and often tackling breaches in international law. So this is a really worrying divide. There's been an interesting paper by Alexandra Hoffer a couple of years ago. There's some other law scholars who are looking into these tensions. But I would say it's a really important question going forward, because in 10 or 20 years, there are going to be more actors using sanctions. We know that China has started to use sanctions. It now has its own set of legislation to allow it to use autonomous sanctions of different kinds. We're seeing a growing number of countries in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, and Asia, who are starting to use different types of sanctions measures, sometimes more transparently than others. And so what we have going forward is the risk of a very uneven playing field and a lack of global agreements on how these autonomous sanctions should be used.
Erica, that leads me perfectly to the next question, which was really going to ask you to look forward. So we started our conversation with you, I think, looking back at the origins of targeted sanctions or smart sanctions, which were developed in many ways as a response to the perceived kind of humanitarian problems that were inherent to very broad, comprehensive sanctions programs. And then we've also discussed how in the last couple years, there has been an evolution even on top of the sort of smart sanctions discourse and those policies, so that we actually get these sort of standing exemptions and deal with some of the problems that are inherent to even the targeted sanctions. When you look forward 20 years from now, I mean, given that you've described this, I think, challenging international environment where countries are increasingly being pit against one another because of the increased use of economic coercion, do you expect that we will see more progress in the mitigation of humanitarian harms associated with sanctions? Or are we looking at a situation where we've had a very good moment right now because there has been enough international cooperation, let's say at the UN level, to get something like the Security Council Resolution 2664 over the line? But moving forward, that cooperation is going to be harder to do, and actually we'll see some backsliding.
I would say so much more needs to be done, and so much more urgently than is being done already, because a lot of the work is currently thinking about current problems. And I don't see very many people looking forward 10, 20 years. And that's what I and you and some of our other close colleagues have been trying to encourage others to do, because it's absolutely vital. First of all, we're seeing this rapidly growing complexity in the international compliance landscape. It's not just sanctions, it's all the other measures I mentioned already. And there's a whole load of other types of legislation, laws that are coming into effect that also add to this really complex, costly, confusing compliance environment, criminal laws, and so on. And so what we're seeing is the work of various companies and NGOs and so on is just getting harder and harder. And alongside this, we're now looking at a situation whereby a growing number of countries around the world are being heavily, if not completely, cut off from the international financial sector. And this means that there's either very limited banking services like Syria, there's hardly anything now, or certain countries like DPRK, North Korea, where there are no banking links left. And so you've got a growing number of countries, I can name many others as well, where you're having to think about these very expensive, unsustainable, often insecure ad hoc solutions. It's either the resort to things like money and value transfer services like Hawala, or you're thinking about carrying cash across borders. It could be in suitcases, it could be bulk cash transfers to Afghanistan. There's been around $3 billion transferred since the Taliban came back into de facto control. Or you're having to think about other types of complicated economic currency settlements without crossing borders. And this is not in anyone's interest. And I would say there are various reasons for this. First of all, it's the humanitarian argument that we already talked about. The second is we know it undermines political and diplomatic goodwill. We saw that in Iran, after the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action or Iran nuclear deal was agreed, companies still were reluctant to go back into Iran. You know this very well. And this ultimately served to undermine some of the goodwill that was underway at the time in some of the diplomatic talks with Tehran and all of the different other players at the time. I also think that there are kind of national security concerns here, because we know that financial exclusion actually serves as a driver for armed conflict, for inequalities, gender inequality, poverty. It can serve as a driver for human rights abuses, including modern slavery and human trafficking, which is now the number one illicit trade, I believe, in the world. And so it can also fuel terrorism, extremist ideologies. So we really don't want a situation whereby the sanctions and related regulations are causing an increasing number of countries to become financially excluded, kind of by accident. But then that serves as a driver for the very problems that those regulations and sanctions are trying to tackle. So it's a vicious circle, and it's really important that this doesn't get worse, because the trajectory we're seeing is this growing number of countries being cut off from the financial sector, correspondent banks dropping out. The decline of correspondent banking relationships has been called a global crisis by the IMF, the World Bank, the Financial Action Task Force, Financial Stability Board, and so on. But it remains a really niche topic. And we saw the US Treasury introducing the 2023 de-risking strategy. The UK government, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, have now introduced a sanctions strategy. I think these are all important steps forward. But ultimately, there's an urgency to this. And if it's not tackled, the legitimacy and the effectiveness of sanctions will be further called into question, in my view. Particularly at a time when it's really important that we're able to push back on those narratives. If you're coming from a sanctioning authority, you need a way of pushing back on those narratives and demonstrate that you're doing whatever you can to slow this problem down, and ultimately to ensure that the measures that have become sanctions are now the tool of choice, that really are the instrument of foreign and security policy of choice. And so we need to safeguard them. If you want them to work, this is my message to governments, if you want them to work, you need to safeguard their future. And that means ensuring that they become more targeted again, and that any of these harms are accounted in whatever way possible.
So clearly, even more resources and efforts are going to have to be spent in the next 20 years as part of this advocacy if we're going to keep ahead of these problems. Erica, we've reached the end of our time, which means I need to ask you the final question I ask every guest on the show. When did you realize that sanctions are changing the world?
I think I've worked now on sanctions for almost 20 years, and so much has changed in that time. Some of the big events of the day we've already touched on, but I will end with the fact that since Russia sanctions have been intensified following its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we've seen this explosion of sanctions units and growth of sanctions capacity across various governments. And if I take the example of the UK, it's gone from a small unit post-Brexit, something like 15, 20 people, to over 300 people now. Netherlands has just set up its own unit. It's something like 15 people now. And so we're seeing this growth in sanctions professionals, in governments, in banks, in a whole host of private sector entities. NGOs now have their own sanctions units of certain kinds, sanctions expertise. So I think this skills, expertise, capacity is only going to become more important. And so I think that engaging with the next generation on sanctions is really vital.
I totally agree with that. Erica, thank you for a fascinating discussion, and thank you also for all of your efforts to ease humanitarian access for people living under sanctions.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm Esfandiar Batmagelic, and this has been The Sanctions Age. Our show is produced by Spiritland Productions and supported by a grant from the Holling Center for International Dialogue. Thanks for listening.